Out of the street corners they scream. You knew it was coming. You've been waiting for this for months. Rumour hardened into fear and now they scream at you. The sirens, their hysterical wail tearing through the white noise of the city. And you run. You run to pick up those things that can never be replaced. A picture of them in the days when they still loved you. Your mother's wedding ring. And then you turn to your shelf of games. You only have room for 5. 5 games for Doomsday. 5 Games for Doomsday is a show in which board game personalities are thrust into a cabin in the woods to outrun an oncoming disaster, but can only take 5 of their games with them. But which will they choose? My guest this week first came to widespread notice when he invented a whole new genre of games. The first example of this was Risk Legacy. This was the pinnacle of his career at Hasbro, having worked on Betrayal at House on the Hill and Axis and Allies, among many other well-loved properties. Since leaving Hasbro, his career has taken an almost vertical trajectory, with games like Pandemic Legacy, Mountains of Madness, and Cthulhu Death May Die. He's also the design brain behind the reimaginings of classics in his work with Restoration Games. My guest this week is Rob Daviau. Rob, welcome to the cabin.
Thank you very much. It's nice here.
So to begin then, how difficult was it for you to choose the 5 games to take to the cabin?
It was excruciating, quite honestly. I am such a contextual person. Like people say, oh, what's your favorite meal or favorite game or favorite movie I can do? And I'm always like, well, who's there? How old am I? What am I in the mood for? Is it winter? How hungry am I? Like, I just have all of these sort of qualifying questions. I way overthink it. So this one was tough. And then I decided to just put a bunch of stuff down because as far as I know, this isn't a documentary. And it's more of a discussion point.
Right, and you're allowed to change your mind. And so, what criteria did you use? Was it pure utility, games being entertainment, or depth, value for money, so to speak? Or was there a sentimental aspect to it, something that would sort of chronicle your life through games?
It was more of what games will give me the broadest experiences, right? If I only have 5 games, how do I really get hundreds of games out of that? And how do I, as a person who likes to make games, still feel like I'm being creative when I play? So that was sort of the key for 3 of them.
And sort of in the email you sent to me, you said you sort of have a distrust of best of lists and top 5s and top 10s. Although this isn't that, what is your issue with that sort of aspect of the hobby and that sort of way we talk about games?
Did I really use the word distrust? Because I really like that I decided I was going to be that strident about the whole thing. No,
I think I'm paraphrasing, but it was that.
Yeah, no. I struggle with them, as I was saying before, right? People say, what's your favorite food? And I honestly, I live someplace in New England in the United States, which is very seasonal. I go, well, that answer is very different in February than July. And it's very different from breakfast and from dinner and all these things. And like I said, I feel like putting something down and saying, this is my favorite food. You're like, really? You can just all the time decide that? You never change your mind? You're never in a different mood? Like you never get tired of it? I had a friend on Twitter the other day say that Slay the Spire was game of the decade. And I had the same immediate reaction. I'm like, what are you judging? Sales? Entertainment? Changing the industry? Like I just overthink it. It's not a good habit because I take it way too seriously, apparently, but that's just the way my brain works.
I mean, I think people see their favourite, maybe not their top 10, but their favourite as somehow representing them in some way. It says something about who they consider themselves to be as a person. I mean, do you have a favourite game, and do you think that it reflects something about your ethos and the face you turn to the world?
You know, people always said, what's your favorite game to me? And for years I didn't have an answer. And then I discovered it, which is my favorite game is the first edition of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, but only if I'm 12 years old and playing in my basement during the summer. Right. Like I play it now and I go, oh, this game's sort of clunky and, you know, like, wow, these rules don't make any sense. But that game and how it made me feel like that the universe was open and that I was a storyteller, that was a magical time. And that game will always have a special place for me because of it, because it was of a time, it was of a place, and I was young enough to sort of first of all, have the free time to just do that day after day after day with people. And also everything was brand new. I wasn't jaded, right? A wizard in a bar comes up to you and offers you a question like, this is the first time this has ever happened to me, and it's amazing. So that has become my favorite game when people ask me that question.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when I got into gaming, this was like 2012, and I remember for the first sort of 4 to 6 months, everything I played was amazing. And I remember watching video reviews and people were saying, oh, well, I don't really like this. And I thought, it's inconceivable that you can dislike something. Do you think it's just an inevitable trait of humanity that we become jaded and tired of things after a time?
No, I mean, yes, you could look at it that way. That's maybe a touch more cynical than I would do it, not to call you a cynic. But I think the first time you experience anything, right, that you go to a nice restaurant or something, you say, this is the best food I've ever had. This is amazing. But if you went to a nice restaurant, if you were a food critic, and then that became the new standard, you could start to see subtle differences that you couldn't see when it was the first time, because you've sort of renormalized what you experience. And so you're capable of being discerning in a way that you can't when everything is new and fresh. Now, it's not necessarily more fun there to be in that place, because what is it? You can be analytical and you can be appreciative, but you do lose some sort of enjoyment from the wonderment of everything being new and fresh. And like, how can you be critical? This is just great. And I'm a big food person. Obviously, I make a lot of food analogies, and every once in a while I treat myself to a restaurant which is way outside my, like price class. And I go there and I'm just delighted and I'm smiling and I'm watching all this, and I look around and everyone else is just having a meal. And I think, ooh, I kind of glad I don't have the money to do this often, because I love that it's special for me.
And sort of when it comes to sort of a sense of wonderment, you've been a game professional for a long time now. Do you still ever feel that sense of wonderment when just playing a game as a player? Or are you always switched on, always analyzing, always criticizing?
I get moments of wonderment, but yeah, no, if you do this, it'll be 21 years. If you do this as a job, then it starts to become, I don't want to say work, but it becomes a job, right? It becomes analytical. It becomes introspective. I don't do anything in video games or role playing. So when I play those, I can sort of turn my brain off and just enjoy it as a consumer for the most part. So I tend to play those as more of an escapist mode. But, I guess the analogy I could make is when I was a kid, Christmas was just sort of this wonderful thing. And it just sort of happened, and it was magical for all the reasons it can be when you're a kid. And now as an adult, I host Christmas, and I get a contentment and an enjoyment of bringing that sort of Christmas spirit and holiday spirit to others. But it's work, it's effort to get there, right? Like, I'm creating the magic, not just, taking it sort of like at face value. And so there's a real sense of enjoyment about creating magical experiences for other people, but it's definitely different from just getting to enjoy them from the outside.
And if we go back then to the beginning, to your childhood, when did games first enter your life? And did you come from a family of gamers, or was this something that you pursued yourself?
My mother was, and to some extent still is, a gamer, although she enjoys more simplistic, board games, the more mass market ones, the Parker Brothers and Milton Bradleys or Waddingtons. I did play a lot of board games when I was a kid, jigsaw puzzles, but I was always sort of a puzzly, gamey mind, right? I would get magazines with word searches and things like that, and I would get some games like for my birthday, but I wasn't a really big gamer. It was that Dungeons and Dragons at age 11 that really changed my approach to sort of how I thought about games and seeing what the world could offer. And I really became a big role-playing person and a big comic book person at that point. I was also would have been about 11 years old, 10, 9, when the Atari 2600 came out. And I had a Commodore 64 computer, and I played all those like text adventure games, and it was a big digital gamer in sort of the middle school into high school years. So I sort of consumed them from about age 11 to age 16. And then the first sort of bubble of console games had gone away, and the second one hadn't come out. And then I got my driver's license, and I got a girlfriend, and I, moved on to sort of too cool for games phase, but I never quite got out of it. and I always sort of played. But yeah, I did not expect to be a board game designer. But when the opportunity arose, I jumped at it.
I mean, when did you first realize you had an aptitude for game design? I mean, were you one of those sort of DMs who very quickly started designing your own scenarios and your own house rules and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I did, but I thought everyone did that. And I think to some extent first edition sort of encouraged that because the rules were kind of a mess and there weren't that many modules and they were sort of limited scope. So having to create other adventures was just part of it. But I would say, I don't really like the magic system in D&D where you get one spell and it's gone. Why don't you have like a magic, like a mana point system? Or I don't like initiative where everyone just sort of goes in order like you're in an assembly line in a queue in a circle. Like what if a dagger could go twice as often as a sword? And I would sort of cobble together these different systems. And I was at a very small local game convention, but still a game convention with a few hundred people. And I was running my own table with a custom made adventure at age like 14 for adults. Didn't think twice about it, but yet sort of I didn't put it together that this was something I was either good at or had experience that other people didn't. It was just a childhood sort of thing I did. And it wasn't until I got some perspective in my 30s looking back on it that I realized I had kind of done everything that I needed to do to be a board game designer, right? From working as a copywriter and advertising and understanding marketing and running these tables and reading and like all of these things I had sort of put together to really have the skill set to kind of do it before there were other options like going to school for it. So at some level I was always preparing myself for it, but it was just kind of a hobby that became a job.
So I want to go on to your first game then, and this is Magic. And what you specifically said was every Magic card ever published. Why every Magic card ever published?
Well, I don't get a chance to play Magic very often. I understand the system, although I haven't played in any real way for the past 10 or 15 years, and every once in a while I'll pick up some cards and say, well, that's an interesting card. What came out in that set? And the idea of being like in a cabin at the end of the world and, I don't have to work anymore and I'm just fighting off, hordes of humanoid, scavengers. I'm going to have some downtime. And the idea of having at least one other person in this sort of just thousands of cards around, I like this both scratches the itch to play a game and the idea to still be creating because I can just look around and find cards and make combos and build decks and sort of do this study of, oh, wow, that's a really interesting subsystem they came up for this block. I wonder how that did because I just don't have time to, dig in and play all of that stuff. But I'm always fascinated when I do.
And so, what was your first connection to Magic? And did you fall really hard for it?
My first connection was right about when it came out. I was with a college friend and her husband, and he had it, and we sort of played. I remember thinking this was before I was doing it professionally, and sort of I was role playing and stuff. And I thought, well, that's kind of clever. That's kind of interesting. And then you can buy it. Like I was like looking at the business model. I was intrigued, but I wasn't hooked. I didn't run out and get it. And then a couple years later, maybe 3-4 years later, I was starting at Hasbro, and Mike Gray, who hired me and was one of the people running the design department, was very big into Magic. He had like 3 copies or 4 copies of every card ever published up till about probably 8 years ago now. And then he sold his collection and ended up paying for a big chunk of his son's university with the money. He brought in like a lot of his commons and things like that, brought him into the design department, said everyone should know how to play this, and sort of encouraged us to build decks and just play during the day and play at lunch. So I went through like a 6 or 9 month period where I sort of played a lot. But this was 1999 or 2000. So a long time ago for what Magic has done. And then eventually we moved on to other things, or we had used, made decks out of all the cards he had. And I had spent some money and thought, okay, I don't want to spend too much money on this right now. I want to buy other games as a board game designer, and sort of, just kept learning, well, what are these games like? And what are these games like? And so I only dabble in it since then. But it's one of those things, if I could clone myself, one of my clones would be playing Magic like every day.
And what do you think is the key to success with Magic? Everyone who chooses this, I kind of ask this question because I think it's eternally fascinating that this is the one game that sort of survived. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's become sort of a touchstone in a way for collectible card games. It was the first, and it's got its issues. And I know a lot of other collectible card games, if you're into them, people say, well, this does it better than Magic. And they're right, but Magic has the largest install base, to be very technical, and it has the widest selection of cards, and it's done a really good job of systematizing things and just churning them out and churning them out and churning them out and sort of finding new cards and new combinations. So it's like it's like the commonality and the familiarity with it is comforting, especially, if the world has ended.
I mean, do you see a problem with the collectability aspect of the game, or do you think it's fine?
No, I don't think it's hidden, or it's not a surprise thing. It's right. It's not like I go to a hotel and I, pay my bill and I'm suddenly on an email list that I didn't sign up for, telling me about great vacation deals in Cleveland. And I was like, when you go into Magic, it's collectible and that there's rarities and you build deck and that's part of the experience. Some people spend too much money on it because of their nature, and that's always unfortunate. And some people can't spend as much as they'd like because of other circumstances. But I don't have an issue with it. It's a very public, here's our model, here's what we're doing, and people either buy in or don't.
So I want to go on then and talk about, you've mentioned it, you worked at Hasbro for a long time. So firstly, how did you get your job there?
Well, that's a long story in and of itself. But to keep things on this, I ended up applying for a job to be a copywriter because that's what I was doing, but was hoping to do more and more in gaming. At the time, I thought role-playing, and there was also an opening for a game designer with a writing background to work on Trivial Pursuit and other games that had sort of like a lot of words. And I ended up not getting the job I applied for, but this game design writer job. And the story is long and sort of comedic, but it was just one of those fluky chances where anything could have gone a different way. But because, as I said before, I had done all these things in my childhood and my youth and my young adulthood, I was completely prepared for the interview and the job, despite the fact that I hadn't applied for it.
And sort of what were the challenges for writing for games like Trivial Pursuit?
Well, I didn't do a lot of the writing directly for Trivial Pursuit. I was more like an editor, setting the tone. They had a team of writers that were pretty entrenched that I inherited as the editor. Trivial Pursuit is just interesting in that, it's always changing. One person's difficulty is another person's, difficult questions, another person's easy question. The big thing about trivia, especially in the past 10, 12 years with smartphones, is it's basically a free commodity. I just take my phone out and look up, trivia about board games and get a whole bunch of lists that may or may not be accurate. So it's what you do with the trivia. How do you make it entertaining? And Trivial Pursuit was revolutionary in 1982 with just this circular board and the whole idea of having people over for dinner and then not playing a parlor game like charades, but just sitting down and playing a board game. And that's why it was so popular. The idea of playing a board game for adults who weren't gamers was very novel in 1982. Unfortunately, I think what Trivial Pursuit has, it hasn't figured out how to have that cutting edge moment since then.
And so do you think it's far less relevant than it once was? Do you think it's a brand on the wane, Trivial Pursuit?
I think so. I think it was on the wane when I was working on it last decade. It still had some legs. It still had some nostalgia because it was about 20 years out to 25 from its heyday. So there were people who had either, like myself, grown up with it. But right around the time I was starting, You Don't Know Jack, like the first version was coming out. And I said, this is Trivial Pursuit, 18 years later. Look at what they're doing. They're being cheeky and they're on a computer and they have like different ways to play. Like this is what we need to be doing. Unfortunately, I was a lone voice there. And everyone's like, this game sold a lot of copies and it continues to sell well. And it was sort of like stay the course, even though the world was changing. And I would, right now, I wouldn't take out a Trivial Pursuit game. But I would play Jackbox TV. And I think that, again, it's not just that you have a question, it's what you do with that question to make it interesting.
And so you find yourself working at Hasbro and you find yourself working on a lot of sort of established properties. what is the workflow in a company like Hasbro? How are the tasks divvied out? How do you find yourself working on particular projects at particular times?
Well, this was, since I've been there, I've been gone for 7 years this month. A lot has changed. First of all, the company the games division has been absorbed into the corporate headquarters, both physically and culturally. So how they do things now, I don't really know. But I was there pretty much, 1998 to 2012. So really the last, decade. It was right after Parker Brothers and Milton Bradley had merged into one company and become Hasbro Games. It was corporate. It had many layers. It had a lot of approvals. It had a lot of brands that were well known, so you could do this and you couldn't do that. There were opportunities to do fun, new, interesting games, but like anything that requires you needed your political capital to get it done. A good idea did not mean that you could get it to the floor. You had to convince the right people and sell the right people. And I was sort of oblivious to it at first and then awful at it right till the very last day. I was, not, other than getting Risk Legacy through, when I finally figured out in my waning days how to apply like capital and sort of bend, arms to get what I wanted. The brand managers, the marketing people ran the show. The designers and everyone else were seen as not, on the same level as they were, even though that it pretended to be. You would be assigned a game. You'd be assigned a game to evaluate, or if you showed aptitude, like I would get most, if not all, of the Trivial Pursuit games. But when new games came in, they would decide, well, this person's good at plastics, or they know electronics, or they do preschool games, or, Rob really likes Star Wars, so let's give him a couple Star Wars games, but there's too many, so we'll also give some to this person, and they can work together. It was the usual corporate structure of handing out projects and organizing workflow and playing to people's strengths. I would have 2 to 4 projects at a time, in different stages of it and different levels of difficulty, which seems like being on vacation at this point compared to my workload. And they would go from anywhere from 9 to 12 months, maybe, with a lot of check-ins and a lot of meetings and a lot of presentations. And that got more and more as the years went on, right? You had more check-ins, more approvals. And at some point towards the end, I said, I come out of a meeting and all I'm doing is preparing for the next meeting. I don't actually have time to design the game anymore. So I knew at some level it was time to leave, at least for the way my brain works and what I wanted to make. And because the company moved and I couldn't follow it, it was sort of like I got pushed out of the nest. I didn't have an option, but it was definitely the right time.
And sort of mass market games are treated with, a fair amount of derision from people who would call themselves hobby gamers. Do you think a lot of the games kind of made by Hasbro are deserving of that derision?
No, I mean, I don't look, if someone's buying it and someone's happy, what do I care? Like, I personally don't like pro wrestling, and I personally don't understand what enjoyment people get out of it, but people get real enjoyment out of it. And it's not hurting anyone. So I'm like, okay, it's just not for me. Right. And I love going out and spending money at a restaurant. People are like, why are you wasting your money on that? I'm like, well, because I'm doing, I'm having a good time. And it took me a while. I mean, I'm well into my 40s to realize that I just have opinions and other people have opinions. As long as everyone's happy and it's not hurting anyone, like what point do we get out of, looking down at it? Now, some of the people buying mass market games would probably enjoy hobby games more if they knew they were there. But that number is not as big as the hobby gamers think it is. I think there's this idea that, if everyone got to play a more interesting, complicated game, everyone would fall in love with it. And having tried to do that with the wrong people, I realized, no, some people, that's not how their brain works. And I will say to people, don't play games a lot. They're like, oh, you make games. You want to play a game now? I'd play a game. I don't usually do it. I said, do you want a brain on game or a brain off game? And they get it. And it's like some people play a game at the end of the day because they want to like goof around and unwind. Like, I'm really tired. I worked hard. I want a few drinks and I don't want to think. I want to do something silly. I want a modern parlor game. I want something that just makes me laugh and I don't have to think that hard. And, there's a lot of mass market games that fit that, the party games. And other people say, no, I want to do something where I feel like I earned my victory and put stuff together in a clever way. I wouldn't be happy working on the games that Hasbro has put out in the past 7 years. And I don't think they would have kept me around because my skill set doesn't match it. So personally, the things I want to make and want to do and the games I want to make and the people I want to make them for doesn't align with what they're doing anymore. I think that when the toy company sort of absorbed it and the culture changed. What Hasbro's doing now is they're doing a lot of toys with an I win at the end. And so they have abdicated even casual lightweight games. I always say that Ticket to Ride would have been a Parker Brothers game in the 70s. That's exactly the type of game that Parker Brothers and Milton Bradley was doing. And then it sort of has just steadily moved down to sort of these branded entertainment moments. And they're not for me. And I wonder how long they'll be for everyone, but their sales continue to be good. Their stock continues to grow. They still have space on the shelves at mass market retailers. So I can just say, it's not for me, but seems to be working.
And do you think there's an aesthetic value we can put on the design of a game? And do you, when you look at something by Stefan Feld or, that silly game with the toilet where you hit the toilet, I mean, is everything relative, or can we say, no, there are certain principles, certain values, certain techniques that simply result in something better?
There is, but what I think when you pick those, like a flushing toilet game to Stefan, I won't get the accent right, Feld game, you're looking at two different experiences for two different people. And the question is, does each one of them deliver to their audience what it's promising? And so if you took the audiences for those two games and you swapped them, one wouldn't even be able to play the Feld game. The other person would say, why am I playing this? This isn't even a game. So both of them would fail because they're a mismatch for the audience. But if you gave the toilet flushing game to a family with a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old, and they played it after dinner and laughed so hard that they still talked about it 10 or 20 years later as an adult, and I'd say that game delivered very successfully.
And so, you left Hasbro, but to what degree do you think your time at Hasbro gave you the grounding for the current iteration?
It was a wonderful place for me to go from an apprentice to a journeyman designer, because I had a corporate structure. There were times when I would do this great game and I would think, if I had a royalty, I would have made a lot of money on that. And then there'd be like 2 years where I didn't make anything that worked. And then I say, okay, I wouldn't have made any money this year. And then I would kind of back of the envelope do it and go, okay, I made that much money over 3 years. It just didn't come in, erratic chunks. I had this safety net. I worked with people who knew it, and I got this sort of front row seat to deal with manufacturing questions and logistic questions and organization and sales and promotions and how to design a box cover. And a lot of it, I would roll my eyes until they came right out of my head about the corporate idiocy and the layers of bureaucracy. And now I find myself, as one of the people running Restoration Games. A number of times I said, Hasbro was right. No, we do need to track this, right? I can see now why this was a thing, why this was a metric. When you have 6 people in a company versus, 20,000 or whatever Hasbro has, you don't need as many layers and you won't get caught up in as much politics. But I did learn a lot of fundamentals about how to take a company that makes branded entertainment manufactured box goods and think about them in the driest terms possible like that. I have kept my ability to think of them as sort of this magical moment in a box. But when you're a publisher, you sometimes have to say, all right, what's the return on investment to going to this convention, and what can we get out of it? And is our money better spent doing a promotion here, right? Like, it's a business. And so being able to ask those questions and being able to be slightly dispassionate about it can help.
So your next game then is something that a lot of the designers who come here seem to choose, and this is a deck of cards. So how important is a deck of cards to the designer's toolbox?
There's one in my hands as we're talking. I use them all the time, even when I'm not a designing game that would have cards. I like just flip them over and think about it. Okay, so we have the numbers 1 to 5, and I'll find the numbers 1 to 5 through here. I also played a lot of trick-taking games in my life. I've used to play gin rummy with my grandmother when I was a little kid. I love the feel of hand of cards. I like the fact that I think mathematically, if you shuffle a deck of cards, the odds that exact combination has ever existed in any deck of cards is very low, which seems ridiculous given how many cards and how many shuffles. And then I think you do the maths and you go, well, no, that's a very big number, the number of permutations of, cards you can have. You can just invent a number of games just with that, and they're fun to throw. I mean, they're just like this wonderful little fidget toy for designers.
And so, have you ever had a design that just comes from sitting, fiddling with a pack of cards, and then you just suddenly go, that's it?
No, because I have a different business model right now. Is I usually have projects all lined up to work with, and I'm not thinking about games in a vacuum. And I'd like to move to that place. I'd like to move a little away from deadlines and just, hey, I'd like to make a game. I'll give myself a couple months to see if something clicks and just sort of play around in different areas and be able to sort of abandon things and not be on a deadline. The fact that I am means that things are going well, business wise. But it would be nice just to design with a different methodology. But my Mountains of Madness game that I did for Yellow was there was this aha moment where I said, I just need a communication game where you're just trying to like play the right cards together. And I grabbed a deck of cards and just took out the cards like 1 to 5 and just started like playing around with it. But I had the idea was that, we would have to make a decision very quickly and we'd all be talking at the same time. And therefore, because people don't listen while they're talking and people just want other people to listen to them, that sort of you would have a whole bunch of mismatches over what should be a very easy situation. Like, let us play 2 cards that add up to exactly 7. And everyone's like, I got a 5, I got a 5, I got a 5. No one's listening. And so I did that and it sort of worked out. So that was the moment where I grabbed a deck of cards and confirmed an instinct.
And so, I mean, I'm constantly surprised. I walk around the streets of Berlin and I go into bars and I see people still playing card games. And we live in the world of multimedia. We live in the world of Angry Birds. We live in the world of constant digital entertainment. What is it, do you think, about the humble card and the humble card game that keeps us coming back?
Well, there's a cultural familiarity to it, right? If you played it as a kid or you saw people playing it, it has a certain comforting feel to it. Same reason that there's regional food dishes, right? Even if you go elsewhere in the world and you find food that you like or tastes better, and sometimes you go back to where you're from and you have something that other people would say, why are you eating that? It's portable. It's understandable. It's relatable. If you say 9 of spades, assuming I didn't pick a suit or a number that doesn't exist in multiple card decks, then people would be like, I understand what you're talking about. They're easy to hold. You can have a drink in one hand. You can put it down. If it gets wet or damaged, you can just buy another one. There's just a lot of practical reasons to like it. And it's sort of like this infinite number of games that are in there.
And do you think that its sort of willful lack of theme makes a deck of cards more universal?
I do think it's more universal, right? And I did sort of caveat it because I do think that in Italy and in Spain they have a different deck, and obviously different cultures in different countries, and so it's not quite universal, but it's pretty close.
And so, do you have a favorite card game?
I am very partial to playing Hearts. Again, people would say, well, Hearts, they're better games. Like, yeah, sure there are. Sure, there are much better games with a deck of cards that I haven't played, but I played a lot of Hearts with friends when we were on business trips with Hasbro, and I just have fond memories of it.
And sort of you've overseen the redesign of a trick-taking game at Restoration, and I myself find myself eternally coming back to trick-taking games. What do you think it is about trick-taking that's so compulsive?
That's a good question. I've never really been asked it before. It's interesting. There's sort of this wonderful curve of dread and anticipation and relief and fear, right? You get your hand of cards and you think, well, this is, sometimes you'll have a great hand and sometimes you'll have an awful hand. And the awful hand, you think, how am I going to live through this? How do I get away with minimal damage? In the great hand, you get really excited and say, oh, this is it. I hope I capitalize on it. But most of them are in the middle. And you think, well, if I get rid of this and I do that, then I can do this. And you're just sort of constantly living with that mystery box that J.J. Abrams talks about, right? You don't know the next trick that's going to be played. And so you just have, if it's a full hand, you have 13 moments of sort of delight and surprise and relief and anticipation as you're playing. And I don't know, there's just something very satisfying about it. And it's the type of thing that you can get moderately good with moderate effort. Just keeping track of a few cards that have hit the table or paying attention to how many times diamonds has been led is a learned skill, but it's not like card counting in blackjack where you have to be really good and really fast. Instead, it's just, oh, this is the third diamonds lead. I bet someone doesn't have diamonds at this point or something like that. I don't know. It's just, it's comfort food.
Yeah, I think there's nothing more sort of, if you ever want evidence that underneath all of the fripperies and the things we take to divide us, to see the reaction of anybody when they get dealt a terrible hand in a trick-taking game just reminds us that we're all essentially the same.
I think we are. I mean, I think games and food are a great unifier. We all eat, we all enjoy a nice meal, we all enjoy sort of relaxing time. We, all enjoy music to various amounts and different people to different amounts. And I do think it's a unifying thing.
So I want to talk now about sort of what you're most well known for, and this is Legacy. Now, I've had endless, pointless arguments on the internet about what a Legacy game is. And so what is your definition?
My definition is a game where some of the actions that you take in one game affect all future games played with that set, and that these changes are permanent. And then after a while, you have played all of the steps, played all of the games that would cause change, and then the game either ends in some cases, in 2 cases, Pandemic Legacy 1 or 2, or stabilizes and becomes replayable but customized. The second branch of a Legacy game is some of these changes will be the opening and introduction of new materials that will provide new rules, new cards, new opportunities, and also new narrative. And the whole thing is tied together narratively. Now, that's a very long answer. I could probably spend some time relying on my advertising background to tighten it up. So a campaign game is something where you can play multiple games in a row and one game will feed the next, but it's usually not irrevocable, and there's usually not new rules that are introduced that are a surprise, right? If you're playing a military game, you're like, oh, well, now we're going to have tanks. Here's how they work. But you probably knew tanks were coming. You could check it. There are other games that are narrative games, but if it's usually one game, and if you play it again, you might get a different narrative or a variation of the narrative. So this kind of combines like those 2 pillars. But I don't have a strong opinion. It's just what I do, and I've been doing for like a decade, and I'm a little surprised that my definition of what I've been doing has changed as little as it had. I expected to go in more different directions, but every time I try to do so, I kind of come back to well, this seems to work. This seems to be the best way to do it, at least the way my brain works. I have no idea. Other people would probably feel differently.
And so what was the genesis of the Legacy idea? And when you first pitched it to Hasbro, were they resistant to it?
Oh, yeah, very, very resistant to it. Well, I originally pitched it as Clue, or Cluedo as you would know it. And they wanted nothing to do with it. And I'm trying to keep it short because I've talked I can do a whole hour on it. And then I, about 9 months later, pitched it as Risk. And this is where I said I had learned a little political capital and framed it in a different way and did the presentation of my life, but then had to spend a good 12 to 18 months continually saving it from being killed or bringing it back after it had been.
And so there were times where they said, no, we're not going forward with this.
Yeah, like, okay, that's great. I know you're doing this experiment and it's very, all the design people seem intrigued by it, but it's not what we do. So I had to pull a lot of levers to get it to come out.
And sort of, yeah, but where was that first spark that you thought, ooh, ripping cards, that's amazing?
No, it's funny. Ripping cards was put in because the first implementation was Risk, and Risk is a very aggressive game where ripping a card up in someone's face would be on brand. I minimize that now. When I say the word destroy in future games, I'm like, you don't need it anymore. You do not use it. Put it in an envelope, do whatever you want, put it in a special box. Just don't ever use it in this game again, because I feel like the idea of ripping up a card has become a defining moment to it, as opposed to like one little tiny thing in a larger macroverse.
Well, I think it's so transgressive, right? Because we're supposed to hold these games as sort of almost sacred objects, and ripping a card feels so liberating at times.
It is. It is. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, I've got a Post-it note, a card, like a note written on a card right here, like a piece of scrap card that I would gladly recycle or rip up because it's just a blank piece of paper with a note on it. But suddenly this other card over here, which is from a game, has sort of sacred value. So I recognized how transgressive it is, despite the fact that it's the same material, right? You don't keep your pizza boxes. That's just printed card. But I get that there's a vast and fundamental difference there. The initial idea, though, came out of, it was a brainstorm about Clue where we were, and I was talking about how they keep getting invited to dinner despite murdering people every time they go there. And that sort of got in my head this idea of games being Groundhog Day, that they just start over and no one remembers what happened. And then there was a more analytical brainstorm on the same day about making assumptions about what board games do and don't do. And I said, it's kind of weird that nothing you do in one game ever affects the next game you play in that box. Like the game is completely forgotten, but you remember, right? You remember when someone has wronged you, but the game's like, hey, it's the first time you played. And my boss at the time was like, don't forget that. And I'm like, nope, it's already in my head. And I don't remember much of the rest of the brainstorm. And I was like, what does that work like? Is that just a role-playing game? Is that like, how do you do that? And then it was other people in the company like Craig Van Ness that I worked with is like, no, you got to commit, like put stickers right on stuff. Do it. Don't don't, because I was like, I can't do that. I can't sort of half do this. And it took a couple other people pushing me to like, nope, commit to this.
And so, I mean, were you surprised at how successful Risk Legacy was, and was Risk Legacy successful in the sort of pantheon of Hasbro titles?
How it was forgettable in Hasbro's titles. I mean, they moved it over to Wizards of the Coast the year after it came out. I had since left the company by then, and it was a rounding error on their usual stuff. I was very shocked. I knew I had to leave Hasbro. I was very excited about this idea. I thought there's a slight chance this goes over well, but there's a very large chance it goes over as people going, what were you doing? And I'm like, well, I don't know if I'll be able to make it working from home as a designer, so I'm probably going to have to find a job in a different career. And so this is like a fun last blaze of glory, last call. And you're like, I got an idea. And so I was very delighted and very surprised because I kept thinking, this might work. I like it. People have liked it, but it's really different. So the question becomes, is it too different, or do people say it's different, it's weird, but I like it? And I didn't know which way I was going to go.
And so then the second announced Legacy game after Risk was Seafall, though it came out after Pandemic Legacy. And Seafall didn't have the success both critically and in the market that Pandemic did, that Risk did. What would you put that down to, do you think?
It's a multi-layered issue for that game. I was trying to get away from Hasbro doing simple games, and I wanted to do a more complex game, and I was overdoing it. I hadn't learned to self-edit yet. And say, okay, you don't have to make the most complicated game. You have to make like a Uwe Rosenberg Legacy 3-hour experience that's also a role-playing game. Like, I wanted to do everything on one box, and so I didn't edit well. The publisher, Plaid Hat, whom I think did everything in their power to make it work, was also a bit of had in the middle of the development sold their company to a different publisher, and was dealing with that new publisher didn't care much for the game. And so it kind of fell prey to a little bit of politics in there. And as a result, I think no one along the line sort of edited it and said, okay, this needs some polish. Plaid Hat was also knew that I had been working on a long time and would probably like to get, some royalties for it, which influenced their decision. And I think at the end of the day, I said, okay, well, Risk was a very short game. It was like 35, 45 minutes. Pandemics can be like an hour. Is this medium really good for like a longer Lord of the Rings 2-hour game that you sort of play over the course of a year? And I think the answer is no. I think people like to play a legacy game experience. I don't want to say as quickly as possible, but they want to get the group together, play over a couple weeks, a couple months, and then move on. And they don't want to play like once a month for 2 years. And so I had a lot of things I had to learn And that game, I learned a lot of them. I'm going to get the rights back in just a few months, I think. And I'm going to sort of sit down and look at it with a critical eye 5 years later or 4 years later from when I finished and say, all right, what was I trying to do here? And is there anything worth rebooting and trying to do? And I don't know. I still think that the heart of that game and the guts of that game and the audience it was made for, it's a very good game, but that audience is smaller than I originally imagined, and they kind of had to work on finding the game I was trying to design.
And so, yeah, you went on then to design Pandemic Legacy, which clearly had a massive impact sort of in the hobby game world, got to #1 on Board Game Geek. And, I mean, did you realize it was going to be that when you were making it? No, certainly not. It was, it came together relatively easy compared to like how Seafall wasn't or other games. Like Matt and I were just putting it together and people were playing it. And it wasn't that we didn't take False Pass or that it wasn't work, but all games are work. This one was just a little bit less. And so I thought, okay, either we missed something or this just kind of came together well. And so I had hopes like, I think this will do all right. I think I'll do okay. I might be able to pay the bills with this game. And then all of a sudden it just took off and I was like, what is going on? And honestly, it's only about now or the past year where I realized how big it was, because I still worked from home. I still made games. I still had projects and games with problems and deadlines. It's not like my life markedly changed other than I made a okay amount of money. I think less than people think I did, which took a little bit of pressure off to, that I'm going to be able to pay the bills. And it certainly changed the ability of me to go out and get work. That was the big thing for me, is I wasn't going around to conventions saying, I did this and I worked on HeroScape. People are like, oh, I know you. Instead, they're like, hey, Rob, how are you? And so it sort of changed my ability to plan my career a little bit. And so 2 questions on this then. Firstly, how does it feel to have invented a whole new branch of gaming and it to be intrinsically connected to your name? And secondly, when you see something like the word tap being copyrighted by Wizards of the Coast for Magic, did you ever feel like copywriting the legacy term so other companies would have to pay you licensing fees to use it?
Well, first of all, I did it while I was at Hasbro, so that complicates the issues. That the first one was out there and owned by Hasbro. And the word legacy was picked specifically because it had been used in so many games it wasn't able to be copyrighted or trademarked and could be used. So I could have made a logo, like an official legacy game, and trademarked the logo and then license that out like a stamp of approval. But to be honest, I thought that was an incredibly I don't think the politics would have been good as a designer trying to get work and build a career as an independent designer, to go out and sort of say, only I can do this and I'm putting my stamp on it and I'm in a position to approve your work. I think it would have turned off a lot of publishers and a lot of gamers. And I don't think it would have done well for my career. As it turns out, I've done the bulk of legacy games. Just because I think that they're difficult to make. And so it is sort of worked out. So there was very little to protect, and I'm not sure what if I would have gotten a net benefit out of it, despite possibly making a bit more money from some other games.
So your next game then is D&D, and you've mentioned this before, but where do you think D&D ranks in sort of, this is a lofty term, but 20th century artistic achievements? Do you think it's up there with major cultural icons?
Sure. Right. It's hard to say. I mean, 20th century made a lot of things. It invented cinema and radio for the most part, and the modern music industry. So, and the video game industry. So it also invented the role-playing game industry. But yeah, I think that there is a lasting impact at D&D. Like, when my kids were younger and we would talk about D&D and they'd ask me about it, I said, the stuff in video games like leveling up and hit points and loot drops and tech trees and all that? And they're like, yeah. I go, D&D invented that. And they're like, oh, I said, it's all pen and paper. It wasn't on a computer, but that's how it works. And they were like, wow. And I realized like the number of things that have been integrated, not necessarily even into role-playing games, but just gaming in general that was pioneered there is pretty vast. So I think it was incredibly influential in a lot of ways that people don't expect. Is it an artistic achievement? Yeah, why not? Why take that away from people?
And so when you play, do you have a particular class and race combination that you gravitate to, or do you just play anything?
No, I mean, I played a lot over the years, and I play anything. I just started a campaign the other day. I mean, it'll only be once a month, and I won't be able to make all of them, so I'll probably only get to play like 7 times a year. But my character is a halfling butler. So, I mean, technically he's a rogue, but really he sees his job as being a butler and aide de camp and sort of the glue that holds the thing together. He's sort of like mixed between Sam Gamgee and Alfred from Batman. So,
and so, yeah, you worked at Hasbro for years, and of course, Wizards of the Coast is owned by Hasbro. How is D&D thought of within that organization? Is it a big deal for them, or does it pale next to Monopoly Life, that sort of thing?
Probably pales to them. Again, I don't know the numbers, and the politics have changed so much. It's hard for me to look back and say it. But at the time, Wizards has done a very good job of keeping their brands and culture very separate from Hasbro, and by and large, in a way that I think has done well for them. I mean, they used to do more things that were outside of D&D and Magic, but they've really, what Hasbro has done is said, hey, we focus on a few core games, or brands in our company, and those are the brands that they've been focusing on. D&D wasn't brought up very much at the time, but a lot has changed, and D&D has actually, with 5th edition, had a very good rebirth in a lot of ways. I just think it's a great game. And there are other role-playing games that I play that I think are more interesting mechanically, or they do different things that I want to do for that particular story, or they're better for one-offs, or they're better at higher levels. But again, there's this comfort food appeal in the fact that so many people play it. You want to play D&D, and you're like, oh, I understand it, right? As opposed to having to learn a whole new system.
And there's something really attractive about that D20, right?
There is. I have one of those right here at my desk. So
going on then to Restoration Games. So Restoration Games seems to be something that wants to fight against the constant cult of the new. Do you see an issue with cult of the new in gaming, or is that part of the hobby in and of itself?
I mean, there's a lot of games coming out, and I think it's an unsustainable thing for the market. However, I've been saying that for 6 years, at least. So, and so far it hasn't been the case. Yeah, it's tough. It makes it tougher to make a living as a designer. If you have a hot game, that means, is it 3 weeks as opposed to 3 months or a year? Right? Like what does it mean to have a hot game anymore? And how do you basically get noticed in the world, and what's your window to do it, and what do you have to do to make it? So I really thought, when I was approached with the idea of being part of Restoration, that it was great to sort of say, no, our thing is to have a game that, if we do it right, there's already an audience that's intrigued.
And so what do you actually do there? Do you oversee the whole project, or is it purely a design role?
Well, it's a small company. Technically, I'm the creative director, so all of the games I either design or develop or oversee or playtest or put my stamp of approval on. Given the size of our company, I am very involved with all of them. Sometimes, writing each word and doing each card, and other times having a developer and more of this, less of this, or an outside designer, and then sort of managing them. So it's up and down the involvement chain, but we do like 3 or 4 games a year, and we have like 6 people, most part-time. So, I'm very involved, but also, again, given the size and the fact that, I mean, Justin's the president, but I'm sort of the vice president, I guess, in some sense. That's not the title. I have a lot of say or thoughts on marketing and promotions and websites and things. I don't get involved with all of it, because I don't want to have my finger in every pie, and I got enough going on with the games. But it's not the type of company where we have 200 people and I have my own division and I'm not even aware of other stuff.
And so what goes into the restoration of a game?
It's basically like we say if this game was given to us as a concept from an outside designer right now, and we were going to do development or something like that, how would we do so? And then we say, what's the important part and what can change? What do people remember? And how do we recreate that? And in some cases, we're rebuilding a lot of it. In some cases, we're doing a light polish. But my work with Hasbro, working on all these different brands, really gave me a good background to sort of saying, well, what makes Clue, or what makes Monopoly, or how do you take Scrabble and make it half as long, or something like that. So this was a skill set I had been developing.
And so, was there any game that was particularly challenging?
All of them. So all games are challenging. Fireball Island was challenging because of the plastics. Return to Dark Tower is challenging because we got a mechanical tower and an app and a board game all working together. Unmatched is challenging because we had to figure out how to get anyone to be able to fight anyone. Conspiracy was a challenge because it's a quiet game without a lot of talking. So would people walking by think that it's fun at all? Dinosaur Tea Party was interesting because how do you get a 4-year-old to be able to play while their parent isn't bored? So like every game has its challenges, and the bigger games tend to have bigger challenges or just more of them. But I have yet to meet a game where I say, well, that was easy.
And so your next game then is a very popular one, and that's Codenames. Is this one of these games you look at it and you think, God, I wish I'd designed this game?
Well, of course, for a lot of reasons. And that's one that, according to Vlada, did come easy, invented it in an hour. But he said it was based on a lifetime of playing games like that and thinking about it. And then he spent 9 to 12 months trying variations on it that didn't work out. And he realized his original idea was best. So it's not like he sat down one day, designed it, and then moved on. I picked that one because I said, okay, there's going to be people in the apocalypse who don't want a heavier game, who want a more casual game. And assuming we're, distilling and brewing our own alcohol, we're going to want to have a party once in a while and do something a little more casual. And we got to keep our mind sharp here at the end of the world. So this is a little party game that scales up well.
And do you think designing simple games is as difficult as designing complex games, or is that a fatuous conclusion to draw?
I think what happens is a more complex game, both the designer and the player have to do more work to figure out if the game is bad or if they're just playing it poorly. And there's illusion, like you play a more complicated game, you say, I didn't quite like that, and I didn't do that well. Well, it got published and play tested, so I must have just been doing it wrong. When in reality, it might be that the game's not very good and you were doing it perfectly right, but you sort of second guess because there's so many moving pieces. You think, I must have missed something. Whereas with a simple game, you recognize, no, that's all there is to the game. I don't like it. It's not very good. So I think it just takes longer to suss everything out. And I think the designer can fool themselves and think, well, I have all these moving parts and this is here and players will do this and players will do that. And there's this lever and this scoring system. And so even if the gameplay doesn't look very good and isn't going that well, you can say, well, people aren't just doing it right.
And so coming on to the future then, what do you have going on into the future? What will we see from Rob Daviau in the next 5 years?
Well, I've got about, like 3 or 5 things that are coming out this year or just like now or have come out or will come out. Pandemic Legacy Season 3 will be out sometime. Matt and I are largely, we're done. It's in Z-Man's hands, but it takes a while because we've got translations to do and art and everything like that. And they haven't set a date, so I don't know when it'll be out. I will be spending time with restoration. I'd like to get that a little bit more, out of startup mode. But I really don't know. For the first time in a long time, I've sort of started saying, I'm turning down kind of projects, like I said before, to just get in a position to design things without a deadline. People have, by and large, stopped asking for legacy games, which feels like about right. It's been almost 10 years, so not that I won't make them anymore, but the requests have sort of dwindled. And I'm like, okay, it's been a decade. That feels like about the right time for that to happen. I I don't know. I want to get to a point where I'm not doing 8 to 12 projects at the same time, so I can sort of get that clear headspace and say, what do I want to do next? And I'll always be busy with restoration, and I'll always have a project here or there. I have a number of games that are complete, and then for whatever reason didn't see print, like the publisher changed hands, or people lost interest, or something went wrong with the contract, or the license it was tied to fell through. I would like to go back and revisit those, and because in my mind they were done and turned over. I want to revisit those and say, well, what's here? What's here worth saving? Can I put them out? So, but I'm putting myself in a position where I can really think about that and answer. So if you talk to me in 6 months, I'll have hopefully a clearer answer.
So your final game then is Seventh Continent. So how successful is this game at weaving story into a solid game?
I don't know, because I never have the time to get all the way through it, but I always enjoy starting it. I play for a couple hours, and it feels like, for me, other people would say, really, I bounced off that game or whatever, or there's issues when you get to the end of the story. It did make me feel like I was 11 or 12 years old playing first edition D&D, right? I had to bring a lot of the story to it. The decisions, it felt like there were some decisions, but they weren't overly difficult. I could let the character kind of shine. I could see the world that they were trying to build. I'm a sucker for map revealing. The fact that there's hidden things in the card, so you're rewarded for like, oh, I see a number. There was a lot of things that for me it was the type of game that was kind of built for me. It is just not built for my schedule right now. And so when I was looking for that fifth game, I said, oh, you know what? If it was the end of the world, I could sit down and just leave this on the table forever, and I don't have to go to work in the morning. And so that's why it became my fifth game.
So one last question then. So you're heading to the cabin, you're herring down the road, 88 miles an hour, and you go around a corner and the back seat of the car flies open. 4 of the games fly down a ravine into a river and are swept away forever. Which game do you hope is sitting on the back seat of the car?
Oh, my D&D books. That's what got me into this industry. So that's what's going to be the thing that I want us to keep.
So if people want to get hold of you and see what you're up to, how would they go about doing that?
You can just follow me on Twitter. It's at Rob Daviau. Oh, I can't pronounce my own name. Rob Daviau, ROBDAVIAU. That's the best way to, reach me. Just send me a tweet at me or something like that. I mean, if you dig around a little bit, you can probably find my email, but I don't really publish it out there because I get a lot of people saying, I've got a game for you, which it's not how I do games, right? I don't want to read something and then be like, oh, no, thanks, and then accidentally get influenced by it. And it's not how restoration does it. But if you have a business inquiry, you can pretty easily through my website, robdaviau.com, find a way to contact me.
Fantastic. Well, Rob Daviau, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And if you want to suggest a guest, or you want to say something nice about the show, or you want to say something horrible about the show, you can contact me on @5gamesfordoomsday on Twitter, or you can send me an email at 5gamesfordoomsday@gmail.com. You can give a rolling donation to help support the show at patreon.com/5G4D, or a one-time PayPal donation at the bottom of the website 5gamesfordoomsday.com. And if I haven't had to limp away from the fang-filled Smurf turds or the cruel reality of time, I'll see you in 2 weeks for another 5 Games for Doomsday.